I worked at a rape crisis center after graduation for a little bit over a year, running a program. And now I do training and consulting on LGBTQ issues, and I'm part of the LGBTQ community myself. So yeah, we are gonna have breakout groups. So I thought it might be helpful to like introduce some agreements just briefly. So when you're in breakout groups, please try to speak. And in general, when I ask questions, please try to speak for your own experience. I think it's also totally welcome to make kind of statements about kind of what you've observed, like culturally or kind of in the field, but not to kind of make assumptions about other folks. I want to encourage y'all to meet your needs. I really love seeing folks' faces. So, I want to balance, like, if you all want to turn your cameras on, I just love seeing that grid. But at the same time, I recognize that, like, you all might need to eat or like take care of your kid or, whatever, like walk your dog. And, also for like accessibility, like disability justice is really important to me. Some folks may not feel comfortable, making eye contact or whatever. Like, I respect that. So, I want folks to kind of, I want to empower y'all to like meet your needs throughout the presentation. We will have a brief break, but it's okay if you need to step away at other times. I also want to ask folks to be respectful of others' experiences. Also, you are welcome to use, like, in the chat section, there's a place where you can say like speed up or slow down, and you are welcome to use that to give me feedback. I think it's like an underutilized Zoom feature. And I appreciate, you can also sound off in the chat if you're like, hey, I'm lost or whatever. I find that, it's helpful to kind of know where folks are at. Okay, so just kind of going through what our agenda for today is going to look like. So first, we're going to talk about kind of why does this training exist, how it came about. Then we'll go through kind of our current framework and understanding of sexual violence and our work in the field. Then why LGBTQ disparities exist. Then kind of these guiding principles of healing beyond the binary, and kind of moving into a new way of conceptualizing sexual violence. And then we're going to brainstorm together like how to apply that and how to move forward. Okay, so why are we doing these workshops? So rates of sexual violence are higher for the LGBTQ community than among cis straight folks. I'm gonna just, hang on, I'm trying to figure out where to put all of your little faces so that I can read. Okay, so the lifetime prevalence of sexual violence victimization other than rape among women, among heterosexuals is 43%, among lesbians is 46%, and among bisexuals is 75%, right? So we can see those disparities. And just a note, when we're saying when we're naming genders like this, like among women, a lot of these surveys kind of measure gender inconsistently or don't include trans folks using best practices. And so we don't really know where trans folks fit into. In general, statistics that we hear that are broken down by gender in the world, we don't know like where trans folks fit into those statistics most of the time. So that's the case with these as well. And same thing with men. So lifetime prevalence of sexual violence victimization other than rape among men is 21% among heterosexuals, 40% among gay men, and 47% among bisexual men. And I did really work to try to find, the best possible data sources for these statistics. And then among trans people, it's 66%. So extremely high. At the same time, service providers have a willingness to serve LGBTQ people, right? I know there's like been a really big push for inclusion that's been like really, really inspiring to see in the field as a member of this community and as someone who's really worked towards LGBTQ inclusion in the field. And at the same time, they remain like very severely underserved, right? And so I've, kind of in working with NC CASA on this project, I kind of started to really try to think through why that is. And what I came to, I started to ask this question, like, what if these gaps are due to more than specific practices, but to the way that we conceptualize sexual violence itself, right? So what if, like, the fact that LGBTQ folks are underserved indicates, and they have such high rates, and we're not serving them, what if this indicates that, like, there are some big opportunities to do better work? So growing consensus is that our traditional, but thankfully changing ways of thinking as sexual violence service providers are too limiting, not just for queer and trans communities, but for all the communities we serve. And so what if our earnest desire to serve LGBTQ plus people offers us an opportunity to serve all clients better, right? So that's kind of the framing of this project. So going back to that idea, so this is kind of based on this idea of universal design, which comes from the disability justice movement. But I think, you know, I think it also relates to kind of a similar idea of like centering the margins, right? Like when we are serving the most marginalized communities, like when we're centering them in our work, we are serving all communities better, right? When we, you know, I think a really silly example, or not silly, but small example of universal design is like, instead of having round doorknobs, having those doorknobs that are like sort of rectangular, the longer ones. And so then it doesn't just help folks, you know, who have disabilities, maybe folks who have like arthritis. It also helps folks who are carrying grocery bags. It helps everyone who wants to like use their elbow to open the door, right? So when we kind of make our work accessible to one group, it becomes more accessible to everyone at the same time. And so that's kind of what we're going to talk about today, not just making our work better for queer folks and trans folks, but for everyone. So today we'll begin to work on shifting and expanding our understanding of sexual violence to move beyond binaries. But first, I thought it might be helpful to talk about our current understanding. So here's also where I'm going to discover whether I can see what's in the chat while I'm on full screen mode. Yeah, if you all want to just drop in the chat, what are your thoughts about these questions, right? So who commits sexual violence? I think I'm going to have to take it out of full screen mode to see your responses. Chat, okay. Yes. There's the question. If you all want to just drop your thoughts in. Excellent. All folks are capable of committing harm. From Daisy, great. Yes. Yeah, any other thoughts? I feel like I agree with that, and we'll talk about that today, but it's not necessarily what I learned, right? So power and control, right? Like that's really central to our understanding of this work. Absolutely. Yeah, anyone else? The most common perpetrator of violence is men? Yeah. Both people are affected. Interesting. If you want to say more about that, Melissa, I would love to hear more about what you mean by that. Anyone who decides to, the survivors, family, friends, coworkers, etc., are affected. We serve them how they want to be served, right? So we're like working to empower survivors in our work, kind of meeting them where they are. Yeah, absolutely. Any additional thoughts? And yeah, if folks want to, who is impacted, everyone, primary, secondary, tertiary survivor society. Yes, absolutely. Yeah, and if folks want to also use, like speak up verbally, unmute, that's totally fine as well. I'm still getting used to the world, the silent world of Zoom. Social control, yeah, interesting, absolutely. As a why, for sure. Okay, great, yeah.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, go ahead.
Hi, I'm Lisa.
Hey.
So I was saying that both people are affected just from someone that had already said like the power and control, because some people think, well, I can't, you said speak for yourself.
But you can share your observations of the field.
Okay, yeah. From my personal like observations, from perpetrators that I have not like personally experienced, but like have observed and have experienced, that they feel as though like, okay, I'm gonna have power over this person, but they don't really know. It affects them in a negative way, as far as like, of course, their mindset is not the right mindset, and sometimes they are also victims or survivors of it, so they perpetrate and thinking that they will feel like what can I say, what am I trying to say,
like they're trying to sort of gain a sense of power by like
like I'm taking this back since this person took it from me, so I'm taking it from someone else and seeing if that's going to help me with my trauma and feel better. But of course it doesn't. And then of course the survivor is affected, of course, negatively, due to their trauma and their experience.
Yeah, I feel like that's so insightful, right? I think you're speaking to this idea of like, when we commit harm, we're kind of cutting off like a part of ourselves that feels empathy, like, and that harms us too, right? Yeah, that's beautiful. Thank you. I feel like y'all are like kind of preempting because this is supposed to be the part where it's like, what's problematic about the way we see the world now? But instead you're like, let's envision a beautiful revolutionary world. Like, I'm like, yes, I'm with you. So we'll kind of talk more. I think instead y'all are sort of leading into a lot of the stuff I'm going to discuss, which is awesome. And I'm so glad to hear that that's kind of the wavelengths are on. Okay. So, sorry, I'm moving around all the little Zoom boxes again. So we can build these more expansive, inclusive paradigms by listening to the LGBT community and moving beyond binaries. Oh, let's see. Okay, there we go. Oh, I think I kind of moved things around. Sorry. All right, so what are binaries? If you want to put that in the chat or just say it out loud. Yes, either or dichotomies from Jason. Thank you. Does anyone have any examples of binaries? Man versus woman. Yeah, that's a very relevant one for this presentation for sure. Hot versus cold. Yes, less loaded. Good versus bad from Cynthia. Thank you. Yeah, great. Excellent. Yeah, so there are these like seeming opposites, right? Yes, no, black or white. You're with me or against me. Beautiful. Yes. Okay. So we're going to do our first little breakout group here. So yeah, Alexander, if you don't mind just typing, I'll give you a minute to type these questions into the chat so that we have them in the breakout, and I'll exit full screen here. Oops, sorry. And I think you all should be able to see the chat. Okay, great. All right, so yeah, so the questions that y'all will be discussing in these little breakouts are, what are the pros of seeing the world in binaries? What are the cons? And kind of specifically applied to y'all's work, right, in the field. Why are we focusing on moving beyond binaries? And hint around that is like, is there a connection, or what's the connection between binaries and trauma? Okay, so, all right, I'm trying to figure out, Alexander, if you don't mind sorting folks into groups, just randomly, maybe like 4 people per group or so, 3 people per group, if you want to do the math on that. Is that okay? I'm having trouble getting Zoom to the right view to make that happen. Beautiful. And I'm going to not join a room, but yeah. Welcome back, folks. Okay, I'm just seeing that folks are slowly returning. Come on, room 2. All right. Thank you so much for doing all that, participating. So yeah, why don't we do some report backs for a few minutes? Yeah, does anyone want to share what their group talked about? You can just I can't see all the boxes, so you can just go for it. Feel empowered to unmute yourselves, speak up. Yeah.
Yeah, I can start real quick.
Awesome.
Hey everybody, my name is Sean Woods. I'm the PPC at Dallas Area Rape Crisis Center, and our group just talked about maybe just a few pros that we saw in, you know, binaries or gender socialization in general. It really starts a basic conversation on what we should expect, like as far as levels of friendships and romantic partners, what our expectations should be on that. It's, you know, pretty basic, but at least it starts a conversation. And there are some conversations that are really dependent on our sex and gender, maybe like puberty. And those are mainly the biggest pros that we could see as far as a binary.
Yeah. Okay. So you kind of took it in a very like specific, gender sexuality direction. That makes sense. Cool. Did anyone kind of answer that question in a different way, kind of thinking more broadly about sort of the good, bad, like those kinds of binaries?
Yeah, I was in the same group with Sean, and one of the first things and it's good to see you again, Anoli. I used to, now I work at OCRCC, but I volunteered when you were the support group coordinator.
I knew that you looked familiar. I was trying to place it. That's awesome. Hi.
Yeah, one of the things that immediately struck me at first was that coming up with like binaries generally, they're very simple. They help to explain things. And that also can lead to it being a con, as that they're very limiting, and that they're overly simplistic and they don't contain a lot of like nuances. If things are black or white, it doesn't, you know, there's no gray.
Right.
So yeah.
Yes, I love that. Yeah. Right. So it's like on the one hand, kind of this helps us. It makes sense. Like our brain is trying to sort of cut down on like our mental load by like neatly organizing the world. Right. And that kind of helps us get through the day, but it kind of doesn't allow us to see all of the nuances of things. And so, yeah, kind of specifically, or yeah, let's hear from a couple other folks before we kind of build on that scaffold up.
I wanted to piggyback on what Stephanie said, because we were kind of saying that same thing about helping us, helping people categorize. We were just about to start a conversation when we got whisked back about whether binaries dividing the world up into categories like that, whether that was natural to humans or unnatural. And you know, our feeling was it's not. It doesn't feel good. I mean, it doesn't feel good to me, even when I do fit into a category or a box. I still don't want to be in that box. I still want to be my own person, my own individual. So it's not necessarily a good thing, but I was about to ask the question, like, is it a natural thing that humans do in order to help us interact with other humans, to help us have a sense of like what to expect and how to put people into roles? So it may not be a good thing, but I'm also wondering if, is it a natural thing? Is it a part of being social creatures? I don't know.
Something I think is interesting about that question is that that's a binary, right? Like nature versus nurture, you know? And I think like, and so Jasmine said in the chat, our brains do that for safety purposes. Yeah, I think that makes sense. It's sort of like a protective impulse, you know? And I think particularly like working in the field of trauma, I think that's such a great point to bring up. Like the intensity and complexity of people's experiences is a heavy load, you know? And so like categorizing things neatly allows our work to feel tidier and therefore maybe emotionally easier.
I'd like to comment on that if you don't mind.
Yeah.
I think that especially in the work of trauma, when we compartmentalize things, it helps us prioritize things. When we're treating clients and we understand that they have multiple needs that need to be served all at once, if we don't prioritize, if we're looking at a client, right, and they are missing a leg but don't have a wheelchair and they also don't have electricity at their house, I would like for us to prioritize the fact that they don't have mobility. So that within itself, our brains compartmentalize things in order for us to be able to prioritize what needs to happen first. And as we're working with any population of people, we have to keep that in mind. And I also think that we do that, and I think it goes back all the way to, I guess, when we were cavemen and compartmentalizing, okay, I'm safe around these people, but I'm not safe around these people, or these group of people accept me, these group of people do not. And I think that if we don't lose that, then we lose that sense of safety and that sense of security. So boxes are important. They're not all the end all to be all, but I think they are important when it comes to how we are going to interact with others.
Yeah, I hear we're making strong cases for boxes and categories. I hear that, it makes sense to me. I'm not totally opposed. So, but I'm wondering kind of, so then why, so right, so this is like a coping mechanism that's gotten us this far. So why are we focusing on moving beyond them? Like what's the utility and kind of thinking past them?
I think over time that we recognize that not everyone fits into the same two boxes that we've created for the last how many ever years.
Sure.
And so now that we are opening our eyes to different things with the help of social media, marketing, and engagement pieces, we are able to see that, okay, everybody doesn't fit in this box, which means other people aren't being served. They're not getting their needs met. So how can we assist these people that don't fit into these boxes? So I think that's what's happening here. It's just a more prominent thing because it's shown more. And so because it's shown more, it's like, okay, well, now we know it exists. So we still have to attack the problem. We can't attack a problem that we don't know exists, right? So now that we understand that we have a problem and we know that we need to fix it, we're able to kind of categorize how we go about that.
Yeah, so we're recognizing that non-binary people exist and that it's really important to serve them, to engage with them in a way that's respectful.
Yes.
Let's see. We are all different and they keep trying to make us fit in that box that Jasmine is talking about. Awesome. Yeah, that's from Maria Harkins in the chat. Great. Yeah. And so what about this idea that, is there a connection between binaries and trauma? What do folks think? I realize it's sort of an abstract question.
I think trauma leads us to think in more binary ways because in the wake of trauma, we've had some control stripped away and we want to have a sense of control again.
Yeah.
And so I think it's part of the sort of the survival brain is like, let's really simplify things a lot so I can make a split second, not even decision, but like a response that's going to preserve my safety.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, any other thoughts about that?
I think that binary thinking absolutely has a component, like a survival mechanism component that probably happens biologically. But I also think that it is super deeply rooted in like breaking up like collective power between people as well. Like it's a socialization piece as well of like, if you can divide people along lines, then you can split collective power between community. And so I think, and in the name of trauma, like that's traumatizing of us to be divided from other humans, but also in the idea of like, if we've been conditioned to think that us against them thinking is how we ensure our own like power and ensure our own protection, then when we're in like traumatized states, we're gonna look for who is the against me and who is the for me or whatever. And so I think that it's also a social dynamic that we've been like conditioned to think in the binary of like us against them, so that we're never actually building collectively.
Yes, I love that. That is so, yeah, I think that's a great example of like an idea I had not at all thought about when I was creating this presentation that I'm so glad we arrived at together. So this is why I love facilitating. Thank you. Yeah, that's amazing. Any last thoughts before we move on? Okay. So yes, I think everything that everyone said is really right on, right? So to kind of summarize, you know, binaries allow our work to be neater, simpler, easier, and at the same time, they kind of prevent us from seeing the complexity of things. They keep us in this like with us or against us mindset, and they're also kind of a part, they're both a part of trauma and part of kind of the way that we've been socialized. I hope that kind of captured everything. So I think something that was really, so this was kind of like a hunch that I had. And then when I started doing research for this work, I found this literature review that was like, it was like reviewed all of the qualitative studies on healing from sexual violence. And their big thesis statement, the thing that they found in all the research is that synthesizing contradictions is the essence of healing. Right. And so that was like very affirming to me, like, okay, I'm on the right track. Like it really is about moving beyond binaries, you know? And I think this is related to DBT, which I have a little bit of background in, which is like a therapeutic modality that's for, folks who've experienced complex trauma, right? Which is also kind of about synthesizing contradictions or dialectics. Okay, so now we're going to talk about why LGBTQ disparities exist. So we talked about the disparities themselves at the beginning. I think this is important because I think sometimes there's a temptation, you know, maybe not even on a conscious level, to like the first thing, word that comes up is like, whoa, why are there these disparities? You know, I think sometimes it's in conflict with this stereotype or like this conceptualization that we have that sexual violence is about patriarchy, right? So why is it that there's so much sexual violence in the LGBTQ community? And sometimes we may blame LGBTQ folks for those experiences. And so I think it's really important to kind of provide this larger context and understanding. So why? So LGBTQ folks face disproportionate violence at 3 levels. That kind of all feeds into these disparities that we saw. So first, they face institutional violence. So some examples, the trans unemployment rate is 3 times that of the general population. 13% of LGBTQ people feel they could be fired because their workplace is unwelcoming. 1 in 3. So when we're talking about institutions, kind of in this context, I'm also going to be talking about school and family, kind of these settings folks are in. So 1 in 3 LGBTQ students miss school because they feel unsafe. LGBTQ youth are more likely to experience child abuse in the home. So we have things like queer folks are more likely to like drop out of high school for these reasons. And so kind of collectively, these experiences of institutional discrimination and violence put queer and trans folks in situations such as homelessness, foster care, or survival sex work that make them more vulnerable to sexual violence. And so then, you know, when they're in those situations, they're facing predatory violence from outside of the community. And so that might look like hate crimes. So 4% of anti-LGBTQ hate in 2017 was sexual violence. Corrective rape is a form of sexual violence that's, you know, supposedly intended to change lesbians or asexual folks' sexual orientation. An example of this also is of trans women who interacted with the police while police thought they were doing sex work. 27% were sexually assaulted. And we know that that population is disproportionately trans women of color, right? So also I just want to pause and like, I know I'm sorry, I should have given like a trigger warning. I apologize. I realize I'm throwing really heavy, like a lot of really heavy statistics at folks. I mean, I know we're like in this field and maybe we're expecting this going into trainings, but at the same time, like this is really painful to kind of all like hold and hear about and layer. So yeah, again, want to just encourage folks to take care of themselves as needed, breathe, turn off your camera if you want to. So there is this quote from this old paper about sexual violence in the lesbian community that I thought, or against lesbians, that I thought kind of summed up some of this. So across the lifespan, sexual violence is a penalty for stepping out of normative gender roles, right? And so we see this, one example of this is the more gender nonconforming LGBTQ youth are, the more abuse they experience. So we see these kind of correlations. Okay, and then the last form of violence is like intimate violence from inside the community. And so rates of intimate partner violence among LGBTQ folks are at least as high as in the rest of the population. Although I do want to point out that abusers might not be LGBTQ themselves. And so, you know, bisexual folks and trans folks we saw have the highest rates, right? And those folks are not necessarily dating people within the community. They might be dating straight or cisgender, straight and cisgender folks. And so, yeah, even though it's intimate violence, it might not be within community violence. However, obviously there is some community violence within the LGBT community. You know, and one possible explanation of that is that evidence shows that intimate partner violence is linked to life stressors, including minority stress, right? So there's correlations between IPV and stuff like, you know, economic disparities or depression, kind of stress, right? And all these other stressors we're talking about could potentially contribute to folks' desire to like regain power, kind of as folks mentioned earlier, right, through a tactic like IPV. Whew. Okay. So we do, so there's, I guess this is a great time for a break actually after all that heaviness, but any like, I think we have time for questions or thoughts kind of in response to that. If folks want to sound off in the chat or take their mic off before we go to break. And it's also okay if you don't want to and just want to take a break.
I have a question. Although I feel like at some point it'll probably come up, but as it relates specifically to this slide in terms of sexual violence occurring either inside the community or a result of domestic violence, how there may be survivors who are not comfortable or unwilling to find sources of support outside of the community because of stigmatization of being part of the LGBTQ community. And so I'm wondering kind of how that affects this as well.
Yeah, I think that I mean, I think that has a lot. Yeah, I really appreciate you bringing that up because I think I don't have it specifically in. So this presentation is sort of like a movie trailer for all of the of the whole workshop series. So I think I was planning on tackling that more in the like specific training. But yeah, I think that's actually a good point because I think that has a lot to do with why folks are underserved is because, you know, they may feel like they're representing their whole community and don't, you know, if they're in an, you know, maybe they're going to enter a support group where folks in the group have never met a trans person before and their first encounter with the trans person is learning that their, you know, transgender partner also harmed them, you know, or that they, you know, the kind of, or that they're doing sex work, right? You know, that it like kind of feeds these stereotypes that folks may have, you know, they're kind of seeing themselves through these outsiders' eyes. And that can be, yeah, really challenging or painful. So I think maybe not as much today, maybe I'll try to think about if there's a way to talk about that a little bit today, but definitely during the training at the conference, which is on like sexual orientation and during the gender training as well. Yeah, any other questions or thoughts? Okay, let me see what time we're at. 1:45. And we have until 3. Yeah, let's do like a 4-minute break. Okay, see you in a few minutes. There's a break. Okay, folks, we're gonna start coming back. We just take another minute to return. Okay. All right, we will get started. So now we're going to actually talk about these principles of kind of healing beyond the binary. And so they're organized in the form of like 6 or 7, I can't remember, binaries to to move beyond. And so again, this is sort of like, yeah, like the trailer for the upcoming workshop series. This is just sort of an introduction. And I think the other caveat to this is that we won't spend as much time as we move through each of these kind of talking about solutions, right? I'm more kind of laying out like the problem, maybe problematizing the way that like we stereotypically think about sexual violence and our work. And then we will have like a pretty extensive kind of breakout group at the end in this section 5, where we'll kind of begin to do some of that brainstorming and thinking. And I will be capturing that to build out the workshop series. However, kind of as I move through them now, I think it'll be like raising a lot of questions that you won't in this moment get answers to. And so I just want to thank you in advance for your kind of patience and like bearing with that and openness to kind of learning new things without learning all the things at once. Okay, so the first one is beyond male violence against women. So questioning the role of gender in sexual violence. And so this is the workshop that's coming up next on May 19th. So men experience sexual violence at the same rate as women. So every year, men and women are equally likely to experience non-consensual sex. And so again, remember, we don't know what they mean by men or women. 79% of men who were like, quote, made to penetrate someone else reported female perpetrators, and 9 in 10 juveniles in detention facilities who report staff victimization had female perpetrators. So those are just a few kind of statistics. There are other statistics that, are not, that don't kind of shatter our kind of expectations in this way, but there are also a lot of statistics that do. So this is, I know like when I first read this, I was like, this feels very different than kind of what I have kind of anecdotally learned or like read in like the brochure in my like rape crisis center, which I think had said like 1 in 26 men experiences sexual violence. So why isn't this what we've learned? Any thoughts on like what the difference is between this data and like other more older data? So you can speak up or just drop it in the chat.
I kind of have a question. I'm thinking that does it have to do with the way we define sexual violence? Because this data is defining coerced penetration.
Yep.
I mean, that's a different definition than what I'm used to hearing.
Yeah, absolutely. So yes, that is the answer. So, I think a lot of previous data referred really specifically to rape, to penetrative rape, right? And so I think, going back to this idea of like universal design, when we're including queer folks, we're including everyone, that idea of rape as the only form of sexual violence excludes a lot of LGBTQ folks, but it doesn't just exclude LGBTQ folks, it excludes cis men and it excludes a lot of cis women, it excludes a lot of people and a lot of people's experiences of sexual violence, which we know is a lot broader than rape, right? And so, yeah, how do we acknowledge the full kind of range of experiences in our work? How do we kind of make sure that that's reflected in all of the language in our brochures, in all of the language in our support groups, in the way that we kind of conceptualize sexual violence ourselves? Okay. And so the next, yeah, any last thoughts on that one? Okay. So the next one is sort of the intersectionality section. So beyond one oppression versus another, why there is no hierarchy of oppression. And so this framework I'm going to try to integrate into all the workshops, but I am laying it out here as well because it's really important and kind of foundational. So as people who experience multiple forms of oppression know, and as Audre Lorde said, there is no hierarchy of oppression. So I really like this quote. Would someone like to read it? Oh, I'm sorry. I think I've missed things in the chat. Oh, so yeah, I'm sorry I missed your chat, Stephanie. So for the, yeah, you are correct. But anyway, okay, so would anyone like to read this quote?
I'll read it. It's Jasmine.
Cool.
I'll read it.
Awesome.
Somewhere on the edge of consciousness, there is what I call a mythical norm, which each of us within our hearts knows that this is not me. In America, this norm is usually defined as white, thin, male, young, heterosexual, Christian, and financially secure. Those of us who stand outside that power often identify one way in which we are different, and we assume that to be the primary cause of all oppression.
Yeah, so I think I like to kind of frame this conversation with this quote because I think a lot of folks' defensiveness can kind of come down to this, like their kind of like understandable kind of sensitivity to like maybe the one way in which they don't measure up, right? And so you know, for example, like, you know, folks may respond to the framing of the existence of white privilege and say, I can't have white privilege, I grew up poor. And it's like, well, that's a different way that you deviate from the mythical norm, right? Like, we're like, and so kind of that's the way that you're the most aware of. But there are folks that kind of deviate in multiple ways. Many people do, and kind of those experiences layer. So those folks will face like heightened and also specific oppressions, even from us. So there's unconscious bias that shows up in our work, and we see that in the data as well. So 1 in 4 trans people experience discrimination at a DV and/or FA agency, compared to 2 in 4 homeless trans folks and 3 in 4 undocumented trans folks. And so you can see that kind of as folks are facing these like multiple forms of oppression, that's kind of playing out and how they're kind of interacting with us. And so, yeah, so kind of the question to think about and moving forward is how can we address unconscious bias in our work?
Is that a question you wanted us to answer, or you just want us to think about it?
I just kind of want y'all to think about it. So
okay.
I think we will in that section 5, we'll have like pretty extensive breakout groups.
Okay, yeah, I just didn't know what. Okay.
Yeah, no, that's fine. It's true that like there's questions on the screen, it's confusing. So thanks for clarifying. So beyond gay and straight, so recognizing the diversity of survivors' sexuality. And so this is the conference presentation. Okay, so we often use the word LGBTQ to like refer just to gay and lesbian folks, but in reality, bisexuals are the majority of the sexual orientations in the LGBTQ community. And also the majority of transgender people's sexual orientations. So you can see here 32% of trans folks identify as bi or pansexual. And so in this context, what do we mean by bisexual? What do researchers mean by bisexual? So often that's the only category on like a survey that's not monosexual. So attracted to more than one gender. And so there's like a lot of words that folks might use for that. Maybe pansexual, maybe bisexual, maybe queer. There's others as well. And we will kind of delve more into that at the conference presentation. And so can we tell if someone is not monosexual? It's like a little bit rhetorical. No, we cannot. Thank you for shaking your head. So yeah, so 1 in 20 men and 1 in 6 women have had a same sex or same gender relationship. Sorry, I'm checking the chat. Yeah, I'm also, yeah, if Alexander, if you want to, I have the chat window open, but it seems to not be like giving me a little alert. So if you want to jump in with chat stuff, feel free to. Maybe as I wrap up each section, I will try to review what's in the chat. So yeah, so So I think I'm bringing this up because I think it's really ingrained to assume someone's sexual orientation based on the sliver of information that we have about their life. And so when we meet someone in daily life, that might be their current partner, like who they're married to or whatever. And when we meet someone in the context of our work, it might be like the thing that led them to us. And so they might be like, I was on a date. This woman might say, I was on a date with a man and he crossed my boundaries or he sexually assaulted me. But that doesn't mean that that person only dates men, right? And so when let's see what else. Yeah, so in particular, bisexuals may be actually overrepresented at sexual assault agencies because they have the highest rates of sexual assault. And so of different sexual orientations. And so we said, 75% of women, 47% of bisexual men have experienced sexual assault. And, but then when they come to us, they might not kind of face an environment that's kind of acknowledging that complexity, right? And so like, what's the impact of that? So bisexuals have many health disparities. This is just one. So those disparities include substance use, depression, suicide, intimate partner violence, and STIs. And they're very, very stark. Like I took an LGBTQ health disparities class, or a LGBTQ health class in graduate school, and bisexual health disparities are very striking. Like they rival racial health disparities and kind of just the scale. And it's something that we really don't talk about. I mean, it even shows up in stuff like heart conditions or diabetes. Like it's really intense. And so researchers think that this might be because bisexuals lack community and acknowledgement. And that kind of feels like, how is that possible? But like, we know that social support is so important, right? We know that community is such a powerful force. And because bisexuals are between the binary of gay and straight, many people don't see their sexualities as valid. And so we kind of hear this in like jokes, like, oh, bisexuals are like greedy, or, they, whatever. They're just haven't figured it out yet, and that has a real impact on folks' health. And so data indicates that we are engaging in a cycle that harms LGBTQ clients and colleagues. So we kind of may assume that there's no LGBTQ folks present. And this is not just true, bisexual or non-monosexual folks are not the only people who, may be closeted around us. But that's a space where, because of assumptions, it may particularly show up. And so we may commit like microaggressions or even just kind of verbalize our assumptions about who's in the room, right? And then LGBTQ people stay closeted because they don't feel safe coming out to us. And so then our assumptions are never challenged. And we're like, oh, this information doesn't apply to my clients. This information doesn't apply to my friends or my colleagues or whatever. But, I think, as an out queer professional, like, it's very striking how many people come out to you, who are not out to other people around you, right? So you really see, just how many folks are there and who don't necessarily feel safe. And so, yes, this is the question to ask ourselves: how do we recognize and honor non-monosexuals in our work? Okay, before we move on to the next one, any questions or thoughts or feedback about that? Okay. So next we have Beyond Male and Female, Seeking Expansive Understandings of Sex and Gender. And that is a June 21st presentation. Okay. Yeah, and I'm realizing kind of like, I know I'm moving through this kind of quickly, and I also am like, this is really heavy. Like I'm just stacking a lot of heavy things. So I I appreciate you all sticking with me, again, kind of caring for yourself as needed. And I think, in the actual workshops, I think we'll kind of it's less kind of piling on data and more like, okay, things are hard. How do we kind of reconceptualize our work? How do we imagine something else? And in this kind of, it's grouped a little bit differently. So you've probably heard this idea that gender identity, sex assigned at birth, and gender expression are not binaries, and they also don't always align with each other. And we will totally get into this more, and we don't have time to fully delve. And so there's things that about what I just said that may be a little bit confusing. Just briefly, I use the term sex assigned at birth rather than maybe biological sex might be what folks have heard, because biological sex is a somewhat like amorphous concept. Like, do we mean chromosomes? Do we mean anatomy? What if folks change their anatomy? Do we mean secondary sex characteristics? And so that can be a little bit fuzzy, but sex assigned at birth is like something we know when someone is born, the doctor is like, it's a boy, it's a girl. That's a little bit of a clearer way to kind of acknowledge the role of kind of the social construct of, how we frame biological sex. Okay, so we know that they don't always align, right? So what I'm gonna kind of just take a minute to do in this presentation, the larger presentation will be like more of a kind of gender trans 101, but I'm just gonna kind of hone in on one little piece of it today as like a teaser. So what are some examples of gender expression, right? So that was kind of one sort of sphere around gender. What are some examples of gender expression or gender presentation?
Pronouns.
Yeah, that's a great one. Mm-hmm. What else? And you can also, put it in the chat. Thank you for Alex. I think Alexandra for adding it to the chat. Dress. Mm-hmm. Yeah, clothes for sure. Anything else? Pronouns, mannerisms, perspectives, clothes. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so maybe not perspectives because it's more like how people are kind of outwardly facing, but yes, the rest. Choice for makeup is not. Hobbies. Yeah, so I think the thing about, just to clarify, like, that's okay, Sean. Yeah, so I think I think, right, this is a little teaser. We're not totally delving. This information might be new. So the thing about expression is it's more like a step outward facing rather than kind of internal ideas or feelings. So it wouldn't be like as much kind of hobbies or ideas or beliefs, more externally. So that might look like all of these things. Face shape, body shape, hair length, hairstyle, clothes, mannerisms, hand size, foot size, height, atoms, the presence of an Adam's apple or absence thereof, facial hair, eyebrows, and voice. And I know there's more, right? So folks mentioned pronouns. That's a great one that I don't have on the list. And so I think, a really important thing about gender expression or gender presentation is that it's on a spectrum from things that we can control to things that we can't, right? And so like things that we have less control over might be height, which we have like pretty much no control over. And then things we tend to have more control over is like what we wear. But then something like our voice or our mannerisms are like somewhere in the middle. We're like, yes, maybe they're somewhat changeable, but it would require a lot of work, maybe money, maybe coaching, some assistance. And I think another really important thing about this is that the way that spectrum is laid out really varies based on circumstances and based especially on privilege, right? So someone like Caitlyn Jenner, so much about her and her experience is on the more control end of the spectrum, right? But for someone who's like a homeless trans person, very little would be like within the more control side. They would have a lot less control, and even something like their clothing might not be fully within their control, right? And so you may have heard trans folks kind of talking about how we can't assume someone's gender identity based on their expression, but this is why, because folks don't always have a lot of control over their gender expression, or, you know, the pieces of their gender expression that may be the parts that folks are misinterpreting as important. You know, so there's many kind of things sort of circumscribing that, you know, not just kind of financial resources, but also like how dependent they are on a particular home or place of employment, or, you know, there's just so many things. Okay. So the point is we don't have X-ray vision and we can't tell someone's gender identity by looking at them, but accurately acknowledging their gender identity is extremely impactful. And so, yeah, there's not a ton of, we're kind of just beginning to explore like these data that's along the lines of like the next slide I'm going to show you. So this is about youth specifically. And so we know that using a trans youth's chosen name reduces their risk of suicidal, in one setting, reduces their risk of suicidal behavior by 56%. So that's like epic. That's like a small thing that you can do that has such a massive impact on someone's mental health, right? And that just has to do with like whether folks feel seen and acknowledged as who they are, which is kind of, I think, what we're all looking for, and like particularly what survivors are needing from us, right? So how can our work radically include and honor people of all genders, right? Is what we are, yeah, asking ourselves moving forward. Okay, any thoughts or questions about that section? Okay, yeah, thanks for bearing with me. We are halfway done with all of these frameworks. How are folks doing? Maybe like, if you want to turn your cameras on and give me like a thumbs up if you're like feeling okay. Okay, or like meh, you're not. Thank you. Oh yeah, you can also do the little icon like Stephanie just said. Beautiful. Oh, thanks folks. I'm loving seeing all these little thumbs. Cute. Okay. Great. All right. Yeah, thank you for staying engaged, and there'll be a lot more opportunity for engagement at the end, like I talked about. Okay, so next, beyond perpetrator versus survivor, which I think, yeah, we got into a pretty fruitful discussion about at the beginning, and this really built on that, reckoning with the realities of who we serve. And so there will be a full workshop on this as well, kind of later in the summer. I love this quote by Miriam Kaba, who is a prison abolitionist and a activist, transformative justice activist. No one enters violence for the first time by committing it. So in one large studies of college students, those who perpetrated sexual violence were 3 times as likely to have been victimized themselves in the past year, right? And so I think it's important to kind of be careful when we talk about this, because, you know, certainly experiencing sexual violence doesn't, you know, destine someone to commit harm themselves. However, like, of course, a portion of the survivors we serve have also harmed others. And part of that is just because so many people have experienced sexual violence, that the diversity of that population is going to kind of mirror the diversity in the population as a whole. And yes, maybe there's also some heightened kind of effects because folks are kind of seeking to regain control because they've experienced trauma. But if a large portion of the population has experienced sexual violence, this group holds much of the same complexity as everyone else. And in the population as a whole, perpetration of sexual violence is actually fairly common. So in studies that replaced charged words like rape and sexual assault with their definitions, about 10% of respondents reported committing sexual assault or receiving ambiguous consent from a partner. And so if we are already serving harm doers, how can we do so ethically and safely? And like, what does that look like? What does it mean to like actually reckon with that reality? Yeah, any thoughts about that one before moving forward? Okay. So this one is about embodiment and community. So beyond mindfulness versus dissociation. Yeah, this workshop is kind of more about like will be more about like the sort of therapeutic, like the sort of treatments that rape crisis centers and SA agencies are seeking to provide and how they impact LGBTQ folks. So we know that after experiencing sexual assault, many survivors struggle to feel at home inside their bodies. And so therefore we often equate healing with restoring a sense of safety and comfort in the body, often through mindfulness, but this approach may not fit LGBTQ survivors. And so one reason for that is gender dysphoria, which is the discomfort that some but not all trans people experience due to the disconnect between their gender identity and their sex assigned at birth or their physical appearance. And so forcing people to be present in their bodies can be painful and is a violation, I believe is actually kind of a violation of their consent, right? And so we know that like anything related to bodies needs to be based in consent. And so I think sometimes when we're like, come back to your body, show up, be present in your body, like that's asking folks to do something that can be really harmful or painful to them. And trans people are not the only ones who have a complex relationship with their bodies, right? So people with disabilities, chronic pain, and eating disorders may also struggle to feel at home in their bodies. And these groups are overrepresented among both survivors and LGBTQ folks. And so we know healing takes place not only in the body, but also in community. And this is especially true of LGBTQ folks. And I think this is kind of where, where I think, I can't remember who the name of the person who brought up the, this question of like people not wanting to kind of be open about their experiences because they don't want to feel stigmatized, right? And so it's like, people need to heal in community, but how do you heal in community while as a queer person while not feeling alienated, right? Like how do you kind of build a community or like a support group setting that's like truly inclusive of LGBTQ folks? Kind of, and that has to do with like creating different kind of norms, ideally maybe making an LGBTQ specific group. So we will talk more about that. Okay. So yeah, how can we reconceptualize healing through relationships with embodiment and community? Okay, any questions about that last one before, or thoughts or whatever, before we move on to, I think this is the last framework before we do breakout groups. Okay. So yeah, beyond harm versus healing. So practicing harm reduction, and this one is also going to be later in the summer. So sometimes the ways that survivors stay alive and cope with pain, and so that could look like sex work, self-harm, substance use can also hurt them, right? And so the same systemic oppression that leaves LGBTQ folks vulnerable to sexual violence makes them more likely to engage in these risky behaviors. And so we know that because we kind of see these correlations. So LGBTQ plus people who experienced family rejection were twice as likely to engage in sex work, right? And you can kind of imagine the pathway there to like economic instability, and then sex work as kind of a means of survival. Trans sex workers are also 4 times as likely as other trans people to experience discrimination accessing rape crisis services. So if folks are experiencing discrimination that leads them to use these coping skills, then they're experiencing discrimination from service providers because they're using these coping skills. So a harm reduction framework allows us to instead destigmatize and honor these acts of survival, even when they are messy or painful. And so harm reduction can be defined as an umbrella term for interventions aiming to reduce the problematic effects of behaviors instead of trying to stop these behaviors. And so, yeah, does anyone want to give an example of a harm reduction intervention that y'all have heard about? Needle exchange programs. Yes. Never use alone. Yeah, those are great. Yeah, these are all for drug use, for injectable drugs. I think these are great examples because they're not trying to stop the use of injectable drugs or even necessarily reduce the use, but they're reducing a lot of the risk associated with the use. They're making sure that folks are using clean needles, are kind of like having someone watch out for them while they're using, so that folks are safer.
This is somewhat like when they have like the needles or whatever, they can like turn them into the fire department or like police station, stuff like that.
Yes, exactly. So yes. So I think the reason I guess that idea we think of as kind of disconnected from our work, right? But when I worked at a rape crisis center, we would screen out folks who were engaging in risky behaviors from, specifically, I ran a support group program, and I would like screen folks out if they were like, say, using substances. That was what I was trained to do, because we felt like we were doing it for folks' own good, that that we were afraid that they could be like triggered, or if someone was engaging in self-harm or was suicidal, like I was like, oh, they might be triggered by something, and I want to make sure that they're safe, and so I don't feel like this intervention is appropriate for them at this time, but I would get a lot of pushback from clients because they would say like, I know what's best for me, and I'm telling you this is best for me. I'm telling you that I feel isolated. Maybe the fact that I feel isolated is part of the reason that I'm using substances, or part of the reason that I'm self-harming, right? That I haven't kind of coped with my trauma. And I feel like that's really what I need to do right now to heal and to feel better. And so a harm reduction framework kind of would be like, okay, this person is doing this behavior that I am concerned about, and I do want to keep this person safe or do what I can to support their safety. So how do I kind of hold these things in balance, right? How do I kind of make sure folks get access to the services they need? And how can I reduce the risk from the behavior without trying to like change them? And so we're already using harm reduction when we safety plan around intimate partner violence, or that's what dual agencies are doing, right? Because safety planning is like, the whole idea is you're not saying to folks, you need to leave this relationship, or you need to do this specific thing about this relationship, or like, I'm not going to serve you unless you do this specific thing. It's saying like, I trust you to know what's safest for you. I trust you to know when it's right for you to leave, or if it's ever right for you to leave. But in the meantime, we can work to make this as safe as possible, right? And so how can we have similar approaches around these other coping skills that we are stigmatizing more? And we're doing that because we believe in survivors' autonomy, right? And so, what I started doing was safety planning around these other dangerous coping tools. And so I would be like, okay, so you mentioned that you are drinking more than you'd like to. I can do a referral for you. Also, like, let's talk about how that relates to support groups. Like, okay, what will you do if you feel triggered during group? Like, do you have someone you can call? Do you have something you can do? Like, do you align a boundary we have is that folks have to attend group sober? Is that possible for you? What might make that possible for you, right? And so kind of engaging in these sort of conversations. So how can we expand our use of harm reduction so that we include survivors who are using risky coping tools in our services? Okay. So we are about to move on to the next agenda item. Maybe just like shake it out, like all everything we just kind of were introduced to. Do folks have any like, yeah, thoughts, feedback, questions for me before we move on to breakout? I feel like we lost a little bit of energy. Zoom is hard, y'all.
I will say that trainings like this, I think most definitely assist in harm reduction. If you don't know things, you can, potentially harm someone without knowing. You can re-traumatize someone without knowing, if you aren't trained properly. So I think like continuing our education, not just necessarily in a school setting, but like trainings, forums, discussions, kind of help you learn, and interacting with people who are actually going through these situations. It's always good to be on the outside and read about it and look at the policies and be like, okay, yeah, that makes sense. But until you actually interact with someone who is dealing with these experiences on a daily basis, I think that you get a bit more exposure into how you can, in your line of work, improve your practice, not even just in your specific role, but at your agency as a whole. And just to let you know, I am currently the support group coordinator at OCRCC. So
that's cool. That's awesome. I love that. Yeah, awesome. Yes, absolutely, right. Because I think it can be just intimidating. You're like, ooh, like, yeah, it took me like, it was almost like towards the end of my time at OCRCC that I finally felt comfortable with changing some of these policies, because I was like, this is what I was taught, this must be right, so I think it's like, it really helps to kind of interrogate those ideas, and it was through trainings, I think, from NCCASA that like helped me kind of think this through a little bit more critically. Okay, so yeah, so now we're going to move into breakout groups. And so the first thing y'all are going to do is choose the binary you want to talk about, moving beyond. So Alex, now is the time to release the poll. Okay, so you can assign yourselves so you get to choose. I don't know if you all can see. Something should have popped up. So you can see all the different binaries, and you can join the room based on what you're most interested in discussing. Okay, I think we just got a new person, so we're joining breakout rooms. So yeah, add yourself to a breakout room, and in like maybe 2 or 3 minutes, I'm gonna just add folks randomly based on who needs space. So just go ahead and add yourself to rooms based on what you're most interested in discussing.
Are we supposed to type that in the chat somewhere? Or
no, sorry. So you should get a pop-up. If you did not get a pop-up, you can, okay. So some folks are not getting pop-ups.
Yeah, I didn't get a pop-up either. That's what I was
Oh no.
Okay.
Okay, yes, you can put that in the chat to me, to Alexandra, to everyone.
Oh, okay, I see it. If you tap on the breakout little link thing at the bottom, it'll show you.
Oh, I see.
Okay, there you go. My team was
all
all
so much for your collective problem solving, everyone. Okay, it looks like we really need folks. We have 12 people who haven't joined rooms. We need folks in healing versus harm, male versus female, male violence against women, gay versus, okay, thank you for joining male violence against women. Yeah, if you still don't see the pop-up, you can message me or the NCCASA account or everyone, and we can add you. Hi, new person, Sandra. We are just about to do breakouts. I will probably just add you. Okay, those of you who have not joined, you are getting randomly assigned. Hey, I'm just Alexandra, I'm just typing in the chat, but if you want to also broadcast the two questions, I don't know if they can see the screen. I don't know if so
yeah, I don't think folks can see the screen. So
okay.
I will just type those two questions out and broadcast
Cool.
it to everyone.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And if you want to just let folks know that they have 10 minutes, or let's make it like 8 minutes.
So you want to bring folks back in around like 2:38, 2:39?
Yeah, 2:40. Yeah, I think that's fine.
Okay.
Thank you. Okay. Yeah, actually, yeah, let's make it like 2:38. I'm just like realizing how much time is left in total. And I'm just gonna run to the bathroom. I'll be right back.
Go for it.
They're doing breakout groups, but if you wait for the next round of breakout groups, you'll have more time. Huh? I think, yeah, let's see. We have 3 minutes till they're out of breakout groups. But either way, I don't think it'll be noisy. I'm just gonna send a message to start wrapping up. Does Alexander, did you time it so that the rooms automatically close, or do I have to like press close all rooms?
Yeah, I've got it set so that way I'll press close rooms once it turns to 2:38.
Cool, thank you. Welcome back. Hi, everyone. Let's see if everyone is back. I believe so. Almost. Okay. Cool. Alexandra, can you just inform me? Has everyone returned? Should I start again?
Yeah, everybody's back in the space now.
Perfect. Okay. Yeah, so I thought I would kind of create this little collective. I'm gonna kind of try to be building some tools collectively as we move through the training series. So this is the first one. I'm not exactly sure yet what it will turn into, but we will be able to like share it out with folks. So yeah, okay, so does any group feel moved to share back first?
I'd like to share on behalf of my group, if possible.
Yeah.
Okay. We were the healing versus harm group.
Cool.
So I think at first, and the members of my group can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think we were all a bit confused about how to even go about having this discussion. And so we just kind of threw around instances where we felt, harm versus healing, or we've experienced that or seen that in practice. So we first started with your example about coming back to the body. And we talked about how I haven't heard that phrase since like elementary school, when I used to be like off task or distracted or talkative, and teachers be like, okay, Jasmine, come back to your body. We're doing math right now. So I think in those situations, and to someone who is younger, who is in that phase of trying to figure out, what's going on with themselves and their bodies, I think that can cause harm. But I do remember that. And then we just kind of talked about instances where we've experienced this. So we're in the, I don't know if you're typing this because I said that, but we're in the healing versus harm group. Okay, cool.
Yes. Yeah.
The second part of that was we talked about my personal work experience when I became a support group coordinator. One of the first things that I discovered, unfortunately, was that we had a Black women support group, which I was like, yay, we had a Black women support group. How cool is that? And then I found out that it was ran at the time before I got here by 2 white women. And I was just very shocked and disappointed and alarmed, because that says to me that, because this was done before I got here, which says to me that it was okay before I got here. Yeah. And so it was one of those things like, yes, we created a group that's going to be healing, but in turn, it was harmful because you had someone come in who cannot relate to the group. So I understand the concept of, yes, we're trying to help you and this is a space of healing, but if you're introducing persons who cannot relate to that situation, it may potentially end up being harmful rather than helpful. So that was pretty much all we discussed.
Yeah, I want to add a different, yeah, for sure. Thank you so much for sharing that. Yeah, that's a really distressing example. Okay, yeah, who else would like to share? Yeah, let's just quickly, let's just kind of quickly move through the male violence against women group. I think there were also some that didn't have any, so it's okay if I'm naming one that doesn't have one or that doesn't want to share.
We had male versus female, and it was a really broad topic, obviously. So we kind of talked about a lot of different things, but one of the big topics was just like the power disparity, especially like when it comes to the criminal justice system. We kind of talked about, like, for example, the Brock Turner case and just how, the perpetrator can sometimes be presented as someone, someone that they really look up to and someone that they don't want to, ruin their life because they're a good kid. And then the survivor could be pegged as someone with more disparaging comments. So just looking at the difference in power dynamics, especially if there's like race involved, different in socioeconomic status, et cetera. And then we kind of got off on different topics, but that was like a general overview.
Okay.
Quick overview.
Cool. What about, I don't think there was anyone in the gay versus straight group. So yeah, what about like male versus the binary, like male versus female?
So we kind of talked about how this can also leave out like non-binary people, and also just how gender norms can sometimes show up to be like harmful, especially when we look, so the second question, look beyond like LGBTQ people. I think gender norms, especially when it comes to like Black and brown girls, of like this idea of, oh, they're like already over sexual and how harmful that can be, especially when it comes to like victimization.
Excellent. Yeah, thank you. I know there was a lot of folks in the mindfulness versus dissociation group. Would anyone like to share back what you all discussed there?
I'll talk. So I was kind of I was kind of trying to figure out, like, is disassociation like a form of like suppression? And if mindfulness could work hand in hand with disassociation. Like, you're mindful that you're taking yourself away from the situation, or you're suppressing your feelings about the situation because you are mindful enough to know yourself and know your emotions and know how like this could possibly like negatively affect you. So like really trying to like decide whether, you're saying like, oh, you need to be mindful that this happened, and like how Jasmine and everyone had said, like, you come back to your body and this is how it works and this is what you should do and how you should heal. But like, if really disassociation can be a form of healing for the person. I don't know.
I love that. Yes.
Okay.
Right. Folks are dissociated for a reason. They're dissociated because they don't feel safe in their bodies, right? And so like they have the right to do that. And when we're saying like, when we're forcing people to kind of come back to their bodies through strategies like mindfulness, we're kind of undermining, in some sense, their sort of like psychic autonomy is like that's my 2 cents. Giving away the answers a little bit. Okay, let's see. Are there any others? I do want to make sure we just have like 5 minutes for the next little breakout. So are there any thoughts for the remaining stuff on the board?
I was in the healing versus harm group, and I didn't think about this when we were in the group. But something that I personally struggle with is self-harm. And it's something that I have worked really hard to reframe with my therapist, because even the phrase itself is self-harm. It creates that negative image of harm, when in reality, I was using it as a coping and healing tool. So even though the name of it is harm, it wasn't necessarily only harm, if that makes sense. So just kind of that idea that nothing and no one is all one thing. Yeah, it just popped in my head while we were discussing.
Thank you. Yes, I think you all are beginning to get kind of more, yes, absolutely. And I just want to thank you for that disclosure. And I think, these things are super common, right? Where like, I mean, I think a binary that I don't have listed is like service provider versus client, or like as if we're sort of totally distinct from survivors, when in reality, the survivors we're serving, in reality, many of us are survivors, have dealt with a lot of the same stuff, are dealing with a lot of the same stuff, right? So I just, I want to really normalize that. Okay, so I'm gonna open the same groups back up, and this time, so I did a really bad job of introducing the questions. So I just want to be really clear. We're talking about moving beyond these binaries, right? So this idea of like male violence against women, we're not just talking about, yes, male violence against women is real. Absolutely. We're talking about how male violence against women is problematic framing, what's limiting about that idea, how can we move beyond that idea? And so that's true of like all the binaries. So next we're going to talk about how does this binary show up in your agency's work, and what do you want to change in your practice to move beyond it? Oh, thank you so much for what Cynthia just said about the perpetrator versus survivor group. We talked about how we can address perpetration when the only model for addressing it is punishment. Excellent. Yes, absolutely. Okay, so these are going to be the next 2 questions. We'll also drop them in the group chat thing, the broadcast. But Alexander, if you want to go ahead and open up those groups, and y'all will have about 5 minutes. Welcome back, everyone. Awesome. Okay. We only have a few minutes, so let's really power through this. Sorry about that time management challenge. Okay. So let's see which groups had folks in them. Not all of them. So yeah, male versus female. What did you all discuss? Or let's just do, yeah, who wants to share out about like what they talked about? What did you all glean from that discussion? Okay, something in the chat.
For healing versus harm, I shared that I have been our agency's shelter manager up until recently. So we have a curfew in our shelter, and that's so we can set the alarm at a consistent time each night and provide that extra level of security that a DV shelter needs. And it can sometimes recreate power and control because we're telling folks when and where they can be. So it's just one of those things that we always have to find a balance with. And like I told my group, that there's no simple equation you can plug it into to figure out like, okay, this is definitely causing more healing than harm. So.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Any other thoughts to fill in kind of anywhere?
We were in I was in the perpetrator versus survivor group.
Mm-hmm.
And we talked about how even the messaging that we put out can be binary, versus, 5 years ago or whatever, we would say that there's, he, as in he's the perpetrator, or she is the victim, and just changing the messaging. And Cynthia, I didn't know if you wanted to add to the part about law enforcement, because I just thought that was a really great takeaway.
Sure. And we were just talking about in our group about how so often, even just saying perpetrator versus survivor is this like labeling of an identity, when in reality, it's an event that occurred or something that happened. And there's kind of just in a variety of different ways, just seeing a pattern of a movement of changing the way we talk about people. So, when we instead of saying perpetrator, we could say a person who harmed, or and that's an acknowledgement that that's not their entire identity. And the context of it in the criminal justice system, there's a lot of like journalists trying to change the way that they talk about people in the context of the criminal justice system. So not saying, criminals, felons, convicts, but more identifying, like making it a people first description of like a person who was incarcerated. Right. Because that doesn't put them under this umbrella that they are forever labeled as this one identity, when that's not really fair.
Yes, I love that. Okay. Yes, any last thoughts? And you can see, yes. So there is an NC CASA evaluation I'm going to drop. There's that just got dropped. And then I also have my own evaluation. So I appreciate you all. That I will put in the chat in just a minute, but just any last thoughts before we do that?
Oh, I was just gonna quickly just talk about, since I was the only person that was from a different organization in my group, we talked briefly about how I'm in education and how we talk about like how things impact the kids. Like when we teach it, it seems like one thing is either good or bad, like something that's happened to you as a child and how you adapt to it is going to be either good or bad. Like specifically we use like the connotation of like baggage, which I hate the entire area of that our presentations that we have, because there's an answer to the questions that we ask. And somebody in our group mentioned how it's just things that we do in order to remain in stasis when we talk about mindfulness versus dissociation. So I thought that was cool. So.
Yeah, so not using this like good versus bad language.
Yeah, when it comes to coping and when it comes to dissociating versus being actively present in a moment.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. thank you all so much. I'm sorry that we kind of ran out of time at the end. The earlier discussions, yeah, hopefully were great as well. So I'm just gonna copy the link to this evaluation that you're getting a preview of on my screen right now. What privilege you all have. Hang on. There you go. And so that will just kind of help me, yeah, kind of shape these trainings coming up. Awesome. And let's move back to, yeah, so for some reason it won't present, but thank you all so much for your time and engagement. So you can find me at anolihelper.com or anoli.helper@gmail.com if you want to get in touch or discuss any of this stuff more. Always down to nerd out about it. Awesome. Thank you.
Thank you.